The rain hadn't stopped for days. The river had swallowed the roads, the houses, and the last bit of hope the villagers held on to. In that silence of fear, where every cry for help drowned beneath the storm, a sound of an engine broke through. A military truck crawling through the flood. From it stepped an army chef, not with a weapon, but with a bag of rations and eyes filled with determination. He didn't come to fight a war, he came to fight hunger. No cameras, no orders, no glory. Just a man in uniform walking through knee-deep water toward strangers who had lost everything. He looked around, saw the empty pots, the tired faces, and simply said, "Let's cook." In that moment, before a single flame was lit, the entire village felt something stronger than rescue. They felt the return of hope. The moment his voice broke through the sound of rain, it was like the storm paused for a second. "Let's cook." That simple sentence carried warmth that no fire could give. But before a pot could boil, before a single grain of rice could touch the flame, the reality around him screamed louder than hope. The village was drowning. What had once been streets were now brown rivers. What had once been homes were half-broken walls with names and memories washed away. The air smelled of mud, fear, and desperation. Children sat on doorsteps holding empty bowls like they were treasures. Mothers tried to keep their little ones warm under torn sheets. The men had no strength left to build, no tools, no energy. Only eyes searching for something that could save them from another hungry night. The chef stood silently for a while, his boots half buried in the mud, watching how the flood had turned life into survival. The water didn't care who was rich, who was poor, who was strong or weak. It had taken everything. The only sound left was the storm tearing through the trees, and the quiet breathing of those who had stopped believing help would come. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had once prepared meals for soldiers on the front lines. Now they trembled, not from fear, but from the urge to do something. He didn't know if the food he had would be enough, but he knew doing nothing would break him faster than hunger ever could. He opened the ration box, packets meant for soldiers who were out there rescuing others. The smell of soaked rice, lentils, and dry spices filled the air. A few children peeked from behind a broken wall, their faces pale, their curiosity stronger than their fear. He smiled at them and motioned them closer. "We'll need some wood," he said, but they only looked around helplessly. The flood had taken even that. Every piece of dry wood had been swallowed by the river. For a moment, he stood there, staring at the drenched earth, feeling the helplessness creep in. Then, one of the boys ran off and returned, carrying a few broken planks from what was once his bed. "This will burn," he said softly. That's how it began. A child's courage lighting the first spark of hope. The chef kneeled in the mud, arranging the planks carefully, his hands moving with the discipline of a soldier and the care of a father. He struck a match. The first 2 flames died instantly. The third one fought back, flickering wildly in the wind before settling into a trembling glow. The small crowd that had gathered around him seemed to hold their breath, as if that tiny flame was their last prayer. He shielded it with his body until the pot began to warm. The rain was still falling, but softer now, almost respectfully. Around him, faces began to change. Eyes that had been blank with exhaustion started to reflect the firelight. The smell of boiling rice rose slowly, curling through the air like a promise. An old man whispered something. A prayer, maybe. A woman started crying silently, not because the food was ready, but because for the first time in days, someone had come not to save them from the flood, but to remind them they were still human. The chef moved with quiet focus, stirring the pot, tasting, adjusting, adding whatever he could find. Every move was deliberate, filled with purpose. His uniform was soaked, his face streaked with dirt, but there was a light in his eyes, that steady calm only seen in people who refused to give up. He was cooking against nature itself, against time, against despair. And yet, he did it as if he had all the time in the world. A few soldiers from his unit arrived, their clothes torn, carrying more supplies. They looked confused at first. They had expected evacuation, not a kitchen. But when they saw the faces around that little fire, they didn't question it. They joined in. One gathered more wood, another helped clean utensils. The village began to move again. For the first time since the flood began, there was motion, purpose, unity. The flood had divided them, but hunger was bringing them back together. The chef didn't speak much. He didn't need to. The rhythm of his hands, the steady sound of the ladle scraping the pot, the hiss of steam, that was enough to tell the story of his heart. Hours passed. The rain softened to a drizzle. The first plate of warm food was served to an old woman who hadn't eaten in 4 days. Her hands shook as she took the plate. She didn't eat immediately. She just looked at the food, then at the soldier, and tears rolled down her cheeks. That single tear hit the muddy ground louder than thunder. It was gratitude without words. As night fell, lanterns flickered around the small open area. The chef was still there, serving, cooking, washing, and smiling. The villagers began to laugh again. Children played in puddles, holding bowls bigger than their faces. For that one night, the village forgot about loss, about fear, about the water that had taken everything. They had warmth, they had food, they had each other. And at the center of it all, a man who had decided that kindness was also a form of courage. When he finally sat down, exhausted, the rain stopped completely. The stars appeared one by one, their light reflecting in the shallow pools of water around him. He looked up and exhaled deeply, as if the storm had finally left his chest too. The flood still surrounded them, the destruction was still there, but the silence had changed. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore, it was peace, the kind that comes after the first act of hope. That night, no one in the village slept hungry, and though no newspaper would ever write his name, every person there would remember the moment. The army chef walked through the storm and said, "Let's cook." Because that's when everything started to change. Not just their hunger, but their faith in humanity. The morning after the storm carried a strange silence, the kind that comes after survival, heavy, quiet, and full of memories that refuse to fade. Smoke from the previous night's fire still lingered in the damp air. The pots were empty, but the village was not. It breathed again. Children who had slept with full stomachs woke up with a sense of wonder, as if they had dreamed the whole thing. But when they saw the soldier, the army chef, already cleaning the utensils, they knew it had been real. The flood hadn't left. The roads were still rivers, the bridges still broken, and the world beyond still unreachable. But something had shifted inside every soul in that village. Hope had returned, quietly, wrapped in the scent of cooked rice and wet earth. Yet, even as people smiled, the reality was brutal. The rations from last night were almost gone. The soldiers had risked everything to bring what little they could. They had to return to their command post by afternoon. And that's when the impossible choice came. The unit leader, a stern man whose uniform was as soaked as his spirit, called the team together. "We've done what we can. We need to move out," he said. His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed conflict. The chef listened in silence, his hands still busy drying a ladle. Around them, villagers watched quietly, not begging, not speaking, just hoping. The chef turned toward the officer. "Sir, with all respect, we can't leave them like this." The officer sighed. "We're not a relief unit. We're here to extract, not to feed." The chef looked at the children playing in puddles, holding cracked bowls from last night. "Maybe," he said softly, "but sometimes feeding is also saving." The words hung in the air like thunder. No one moved for a moment. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the weight of the storm. The leader studied the chef's face. the exhaustion, the dirt, the quiet fire behind his eyes. Then, without another word, he gave a small nod. It wasn't approval. It was permission. That was all the chef needed. He turned back toward the people and smiled faintly. "We're not leaving," he said simply. And just like that, a small army camp turned into a base of humanity. The soldiers gathered whatever was left: ration packs, gas cylinders, broken utensils. The chef directed them with calm precision. "We'll make it work," he said. Soon, the open courtyard that had been filled with despair just a day ago turned into organized chaos. Soldiers digging small trenches to control water flow, villagers clearing debris to create dry ground, women collecting rainwater to wash rice, children running around carrying vegetables that had somehow survived the flood. It was no longer just an act of rescue, it was a movement. But it wasn't easy. The floodwaters were unpredictable, sometimes rising again in the middle of the day, threatening to undo everything they had built. Every step in the muddy ground was a battle. Yet the chef moved through it all with quiet purpose. He didn't shout. He didn't command. He simply worked, lighting fires, rationing supplies, assigning small tasks to everyone who could help. He knew hunger had broken their strength, but participation could rebuild it. At one point, an old woman approached him, holding a handful of soaked lentils she had found in her collapsed kitchen. "Can this help?" she asked. He looked at the lentils as if they were gold. "Yes," he said. "Every grain helps." And it did. Every person began to bring something: broken vegetables, half-filled spice boxes, a few dry onions hidden in roof corners. They were feeding not just their bodies now, but their dignity. The soldiers, too, began to see him differently. To them, he had always been the cook, the man who worked behind the steam and smoke, away from the front line. But here, in this village, he was the line, the barrier between despair and hope. They started calling him Sir, without realizing it. He laughed it off, saying, "Save that for real officers." But deep inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose that came not from orders, but from the heart. As the day went on, the chef noticed something remarkable. The villagers no longer waited for food to be served. They stood beside the soldiers, stirring pots, washing dishes, collecting rainwater, helping each other. The army and the villagers had merged into one family, bound not by uniform, but by compassion. The boundaries of rank and class disappeared somewhere between the smoke and the rain. By evening, the aroma of lentil soup and rice filled the air again. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The same courtyard that had once echoed with cries of hunger now hummed with laughter and conversation. The flood hadn't gone away, but its power over their spirit had. The chef stood by the fire, wiping sweat from his face, watching as the officer who once wanted to leave now served food to an old man. Later that night, as the sky turned purple and the floodwaters glimmered under the faint moonlight, the chef sat alone near the fire. He could hear the soft breathing of sleeping villagers, the rhythmic patter of dripping rain from broken roofs, and the distant croak of frogs returning to life. Everything around him was still broken, yet somehow it all felt whole. He thought about the word duty. It had always meant following orders, protecting borders, serving the nation. But tonight, he realized it meant something deeper: to serve life itself, in whatever form it came. Sometimes the battlefield isn't a place with bullets and enemies. Sometimes it's a flooded village with hungry children and tired souls. And sometimes the hero doesn't carry a gun. He carries a ladle. As he closed his eyes for a moment, exhaustion washing over him, a small hand tugged at his sleeve. It was the same boy who had brought him the broken planks for the fire the night before. The boy held out a half-eaten piece of bread. "For you," he said shyly. The chef smiled and took it, breaking it in half. "Well, share?" he whispered. That quiet exchange, under the pale light of a dying fire, was more powerful than any salute. It was the moment when humanity saluted itself, and the army became more than a symbol of strength. It became a symbol of kindness. And the chef, the man who refused to leave, became the heartbeat of a village that refused to die. The night was calm but not peaceful. The rain had stopped, yet the sound of the river still echoed through the broken village like a warning, a reminder that danger was never too far. The army chef sat near the dying fire, holding that half piece of bread the boy had shared with him. It was soggy, tasteless, almost nothing, but in that moment it felt sacred. Around him the village slept in patches of darkness, wrapped in torn blankets and flickering lantern light. The soldiers, exhausted from a day that had tested every ounce of their strength, rested beside their weapons and ration boxes. But the chef didn't close his eyes. His mind wasn't at peace, because he knew morning would come with the same question: what will they eat today? He looked at the empty ration crates beside him. The supplies that were meant to last a week for soldiers had already been used to feed hundreds. He could almost hear the unspoken questions in the eyes of his fellow men. They respected him, they followed him. But they also knew reality. The food was running out. The rescue team might not return for days. And the flood had cut them off from everything. No markets, no transport, no contact with the outside world. He stood up, stretching his sore legs, and looked around the small open ground that had become their kitchen. The mud was thick and heavy, sucking at his boots with every step. The air smelled of wet earth and burnt wood. The pots they had used were cracked from the heat. The firewood was almost gone. But even in that chaos, he could see something beautiful. The villagers sleeping closer to each other, children curled up near their mothers, soldiers using their jackets to cover strangers. Kindness had taken root here. He couldn't let it die. As dawn began to break, a faint orange glow spread over the horizon. The chef gathered his men quietly. "We'll have to make something from nothing," he said. One of the soldiers frowned. "But sir, the supplies—" "I know," the chef interrupted gently. "That's why we'll use what the flood hasn't taken yet." He turned toward the nearest hut, knocked softly, and asked if anyone had anything left. A woman brought out a small bag of cornmeal. Another handed him a few raw potatoes covered in mud, and a child offered 2 green chilies, still wet from the rain. The chef took each item as if it were a medal. He set up a new cooking spot near the partially fallen banyan tree, where the ground was a little higher and the wind gentler. The soldiers gathered soaked planks and pieces of furniture for firewood. Some villagers collected dry leaves and coconut husks. Everyone contributed something: a tool, a hand, a spark. The chef worked silently, focused, his eyes steady even as the smoke stung them. He broke the potatoes with the back of his knife, crushed cornmeal with his hands, and mixed everything into a thick paste. There was no recipe, no measurement, just instinct and heart. When the fire finally caught, it was as if the whole village exhaled at once. The flames danced, fragile but defiant, mirroring the spirit of the man who refused to give up. He placed the pot over the fire and began to stir, slow and rhythmic. The children gathered around again, watching in awe as if witnessing magic. To them, he wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a guardian, someone who could turn emptiness into nourishment. But then the rain returned. Not a storm this time, but a steady drizzle that hissed against the fire. For a moment, the flames wavered. The villagers gasped. The chef didn't flinch. He removed his jacket and held it above the pot, shielding it from the rain. His uniform got drenched again, but his eyes stayed locked on the fire. "Keep feeding the flame," he shouted to the others. "Don't let it die." The soldiers and villagers rushed in, creating a circle around him, using their bodies to block the rain. Together, they kept the fire alive. Minutes passed. Then the smell of cooked food began to rise again. Earthy, smoky, real. It filled the air like courage. The children cheered softly, and the old woman from yesterday began to cry once more, this time not from fear, but from gratitude. The chef smiled faintly and stirred the pot one last time before serving. The food was simple: mashed corn, potatoes, a pinch of spice, and smoke. But to those people it tasted like life itself. As everyone ate, he finally sat down, exhausted yet content. One of the younger soldiers looked at him and said, "Sir, why do you push yourself this hard? You've done enough." The chef looked up, his face illuminated by the fading glow of the fire. "Enough," he repeated quietly. "No, as long as there's someone hungry. Enough doesn't exist." His voice cracked slightly, but his eyes didn't. They burned with something unbreakable: purpose. Later, as night fell again, he walked through the village, checking if everyone had eaten. At one hut, he found a young mother trying to feed her child who refused to eat without him. She smiled shyly and said, "He says it only tastes good when you serve it." The chef laughed softly, his heart swelling. He sat down beside them, scooped a small bite, and fed the boy himself. The child smiled, a simple, innocent smile that erased the fatigue of the entire day. When he finally returned to the fire, his hands trembled from exhaustion. But he felt something deep, something powerful. The realization that he wasn't just cooking anymore. He was rebuilding faith, one meal at a time. Every time that pot boiled, it carried a message far louder than the flood's roar that humanity doesn't need perfect conditions to act. It only needs a willing heart. He looked up at the sky, the same sky that had raged against them days ago. Now it was clear, quiet, scattered with stars. The water still surrounded the village, the damage still immense, but there was warmth here now. The kind that didn't come from fire, but from connection. He whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, "If a meal can save a soul, then this kitchen is my battlefield." And in that moment, as he watched the small flames flicker in the night, he understood. Soldiers may fight wars to defend their nation, but sometimes the bravest act of service is to defend someone's hope. The stars that night hung low, almost as if they too were watching over that small, broken village wrapped in mud and silence. The army chef sat beside the dying fire, his body aching, his clothes still damp, but his spirit unshaken. The soft crackle of the last few burning sticks filled the air as he whispered to himself, "Vi, if a meal can save a soul, then this kitchen is my battlefield." Those words stayed with him long after the fire faded into smoke. He didn't know then that the real battle was yet to come. Not against the flood, but against exhaustion, scarcity, and his own limits. Morning came without warning. No birds, no sunlight breaking through clouds, just the gray mist of another endless day. The floodwater still surrounded the village like a prison wall. But inside that circle of despair, something had changed. People were awake before dawn, gathering whatever they could find. A few men were trying to clear the pathway that led to the nearest field. Women were washing utensils with muddy water just to make them ready again. Children carried sticks, stones, and buckets like tiny soldiers. And in the center of it all stood the army chef, sleeves rolled up, face tired but alive, directing quietly, purpose burning in every word he spoke. The fire from the night before was gone, but the spirit it had ignited wasn't. The chef's soldiers had rationed the last few packets of rice and lentils, barely enough for a single meal. It should have broken him, but it didn't. He looked at the pot, then at the faces around him. Faces that now believed in him more than they believed in the weather. "Well, feed everyone," he said calmly, "even if it's just one spoon each." The villagers didn't argue. They had learned something from him, that hope multiplies when shared. A few women brought roots and wild herbs they had pulled from the edge of the flood. A young boy ran with 2 eggs he had found in a half-destroyed chicken coop. The soldiers added a few of their own protein bars, crumbling them into the mix without hesitation. The chef nodded approvingly. "That's it," he said. "We'll make the impossible taste like life again." As the fire began to crackle under the pot, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of boiling rice and damp leaves. The air became thick with emotion, hunger, hope, gratitude, all blending into one. The chef stirred slowly, his hands moving like a craftsman shaping something sacred. Around him, people waited silently, not impatient but reverent, as if watching a ritual. They didn't just want food anymore, they wanted faith, and somehow, every movement of his hands gave them that. But the weather had its own plans. The clouds began to gather again, darker than before, low and heavy. The chef glanced up. "Not again," he whispered. Within minutes, the rain returned, harsh, cold, relentless. The wind roared, snatching away their makeshift shelter. The flames sputtered, the pot wobbled. Panic spread quickly. The soldiers tried to cover the fire with their ponchos, but the water poured from every side. The chef didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, grabbing the pot with his bare hands, shielding it with his body. The heat burned through his palms, but he didn't move. "Keep it alive," he shouted. His voice cut through the rain like a command on the battlefield. The villagers rushed to help. They formed a wall around him again, shoulders touching, shielding him and the fire with whatever they could find. Sacks, plastic sheets, even their own arms. The wind screamed, but the fire fought back. The pot rattled violently, steam rising through the rain. The chef's hands trembled, but his eyes didn't leave the flames. And then, slowly, impossibly, the rain began to ease. The storm gave up. The fire lived. When the food was ready, no one spoke. They just looked at him. The soldier with burned hands and tired eyes who had just fought the storm for their meal. He smiled faintly and said, "It's hot. Eat carefully." The first bowl went to a child whose mother had lost everything in the flood. She took it with trembling hands and whispered, "You fed us when the world forgot." He didn't answer. He just nodded, the humility in his eyes deeper than any word could express. That meal wasn't just food, it was defiance. It was proof that kindness could outlast even the cruelest storms. The villagers ate in silence, the only sound the clinking of spoons against metal bowls and the gentle crackle of fire. The soldiers ate beside them. No ranks, no salutes, just humans sharing survival. As night fell, the chef's body finally gave in. His palms were blistered, his knees weak, but when someone offered to take over, he refused. "Not yet," he said softly. "Tomorrow they'll need breakfast." The others laughed, not because it was funny, but because his determination made their fear disappear. Later that night, as the rain turned into a drizzle, one of the soldiers brought him a small mirror. "You look like you've aged 10 years. The soldier joked. The chef looked at his reflection. Swollen eyes, smoke-stained skin, cracked lips. But behind all that, he saw something new. He saw a man who had discovered what it meant to serve without boundaries, to give without expecting, to lead without command. He walked to the edge of the floodwater and looked at his reflection in the rippling surface. The moonlight made the water shimmer like silver. He thought about everything he'd seen, the fear, the hunger, the resilience, and whispered to himself, "This is what strength looks like. Not guns, not medals, just love that refuses to stop." Behind him, the fire flickered again as someone added more wood. He turned around to see the same boy from the first night tending to it carefully, mimicking the way he used to. The sight brought a quiet smile to his face. He didn't need to teach them anymore. They had learned. The village no longer waited to be fed, it had learned to cook for itself. And in that simple act, he realized he had done more than fight hunger. He had restored something far greater: belief. The belief that even in the darkest floods, humanity can still rise one meal, one heart, one soldier at a time. The fire that night burned steady, not because it had more wood, but because it had more purpose. The boy's small hands carefully placed the sticks one by one, just like he'd seen the army chef do. The flames rose and swayed, casting a warm light over faces that had forgotten what comfort felt like. The army chef stood silently in the distance, watching them. His uniform was torn, his hands still bandaged from burns, but his eyes glowed with something deeper than pride. A quiet peace that comes only when you know your actions have planted something that will live beyond you. The village had changed. It wasn't the same frightened, broken place that had greeted him days ago. The fear that once filled the air had turned into rhythm. People working together, collecting rainwater, drying soaked grains, helping each other patch roofs and walls. And right at the heart of it all was that little fire. The kitchen that had become their hope. The chef knew the flood hadn't disappeared, but something stronger had replaced its power unity. Every morning now, before the sun broke through the clouds, he would see villagers already up, stirring pots, chopping vegetables they had managed to salvage from the flooded fields. The soldiers helped too, one cleaning, another repairing the cooking area. The chef didn't give orders anymore. He simply guided, quietly, patiently, like a teacher watching his students take their first steps. They called it the Army Kitchen. Not because it belonged to the army, but because it was built on discipline, courage, and compassion. One morning, as he stood stirring a pot of rice, a woman approached him, holding a small basket covered in cloth. She lifted the cover gently, revealing a few eggs, 2 onions, and a handful of green chilies. "These survived," she said. "You've fed us for days. Now let us feed others." The chef looked at her for a moment, then smiled. "That's how it should be," he replied. "Kindness isn't something to keep. It's something to pass on." She nodded, and from that moment, the kitchen wasn't his anymore. It belonged to everyone. Soon, every meal became a collective effort. Men would wade through waist, deep water to find fallen coconuts. Children would carry buckets of clean water on their heads. Soldiers would chop vegetables beside the villagers. The line between rescuer and rescued vanished. They were all one, an army of ordinary hearts fighting the same battle. The chef's name was never asked, never spoken. To them, he was simply the soldier who cooked. But that title carried more honor than any rank. As days passed, the floodwaters slowly began to retreat. The roads that had once vanished beneath the current started to reappear. The outside world was finally sending help. Trucks loaded with supplies and officials arriving to assess the damage. But when they entered the village, what they saw left them speechless. It wasn't chaos or hunger or despair. It was order. It was strength. The people were working, smiling, feeding one another. One officer walked up to the chef, confused. "How did you manage all this?" he asked. The chef looked around, at the villagers laughing, the children eating, the soldiers helping rebuild, and replied softly, "We didn't manage. We cared." Those words struck the officer deeply. He saluted him, not for rank, but for humanity. But the chef didn't salute back. He just turned to the old woman nearby and asked, "Is there enough salt in the soup?" That was his salute. To the people, not the system. The next morning, the villagers insisted he rest, but he refused. "If I rest, who will stir the pot?" he joked. But the truth was, he didn't want to stop. Every time he cooked, he felt closer to something sacred, something beyond duty. It was no longer about feeding the hungry, it was about reminding them that they still mattered. One evening, a child tugged on his sleeve. It was the same boy who had once offered him half a piece of bread. "Sir," he said shyly, "when you leave, who will cook for us?" The question caught the chef off guard. He crouched down, meeting the boy's eyes. "You will," he said, "and not just for yourself, for others too. Promise me that." The boy nodded, clutching the ladle like it was a sword. In the days that followed, The chef began teaching the villagers simple recipes: how to use less and make more, how to find flavors in scarcity, how to turn nothing into something. But what he was really teaching wasn't cooking. It was resilience. It was faith. It was the art of never giving up, even when the world washes everything away. Word of the army chef spread beyond the flooded valley. Journalists, relief workers, and officers came looking for him, but by the time they arrived, he was already gone, transferred to another post, another duty, another unknown place where perhaps kindness would again be needed. He left no note, no message, no request for recognition. All he left behind was the kitchen, and a village that would never forget him. When the villagers rebuilt their homes, they kept one corner of the square untouched. The place where the first fire had been lit. They built a small stone stove there and placed a wooden sign above it, for those who serve with kindness. Every year after that, on the anniversary of the flood, they would gather there to cook a meal for anyone hungry, traveler, stranger, or friend. The fire would burn, the same way it did on that first night when one man refused to walk away. Far away in another army camp, the chef sat by a new fire, stirring another pot for another group of soldiers. Someone asked him once, "Do you ever think about that village?" He smiled faintly, staring into the flame. "Every day," he said, "because when I cooked for them, I learned something the army never taught me, that the greatest victories don't come from war. They come from kindness that refuses to surrender." And somewhere, miles away, in that little village reborn from flood and despair, the boy turned, young man lit the same fire again, just as he promised, and whispered into the rising smoke, "He taught us how to feed more than stomachs. He taught us how to feed the soul." The wind that evening was softer, gentler, carrying with it the scent of smoke and something familiar, something deeply human. The boy, now a young man, stood beside the same fire that had once saved his village. His hands were stronger, his eyes more determined. Yet when he stirred the pot, he did it with the same grace the army chef once had. The people gathered again, not out of hunger this time, but out of remembrance. Children who had once been saved by a soldier's meal now brought their own children to see the place where kindness was born. The wooden sign still stood, faded but proud of, "For those who serve with kindness." Every scratch on it carried a story, a reminder of the flood, the fear, and the man who had shown them that strength wasn't about muscle, or medals, or orders. It was about heart. As the fire crackled, the young man spoke softly to the gathered crowd, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "He didn't just feed us," he said, looking at the flames. "He woke us up. When the world turned its back, he came. When we had nothing, he made us feel like we still had something to give." His words hung in the air, heavy and tender. People nodded silently, eyes glistening, because they all knew their village stood today not because of rescue, but because of one man's refusal to walk away. The memory of the army chef had become their compass. In every act of help, in every shared meal, in every time they reached out to a neighbor before themselves, his presence was felt. He was gone, but never absent. The young man had built his life around that lesson. He became the first to open the kitchen when rains returned, the first to carry food to anyone in need, the first to remind others that kindness was not a debt, it was a duty. Yet inside him, there was something more, a question that had followed him for years. Did the chef ever know what he started here? He often looked toward the mountains beyond the horizon, imagining that maybe, somewhere, the same man was still cooking, still feeding, still healing. He dreamed of meeting him again, not as the boy who was saved, but as the man who continued his legacy. One day, years later, the army returned to the village. This time not for rescue, but for remembrance. The soldiers had heard of a small place where people honored a nameless chef every year. Among them was a young captain who carried an old photograph, edges worn and colors faded. It was of a soldier standing near a smoky field kitchen, smiling faintly as he served food from a large metal pot. The captain approached the young man who led the ceremony. "Do you know him?" the captain asked, holding out the photo. The young man's breath caught. The face, older than he remembered, but unmistakable. It was him. The same eyes, the same quiet strength. He nodded slowly, his voice trembling. "He saved us. He taught us how to stand again." The captain looked down, emotion thick in his throat. "He spoke of you often," he said. "A told us about a boy who gave him his last piece of bread during the flood. He said that was the moment he realized. Kindness doesn't flow from the strong to the weak. It flows between hearts that refuse to let the world harden them." The young man couldn't speak. The sound of the fire filled the silence between them. "Where is he now?" he finally whispered. The captain's eyes lowered. "He passed away last winter," he said softly. "But before he died, he asked me to visit this village. He said, 'If they still remember me, tell them the fire never went out.'" The words fell like a gentle rain. Quiet, steady, cleansing. For a long time no one moved. The young man turned toward the fire, staring into it as if he could see the chef standing there again, stirring the pot, smiling in that humble, familiar way. The grief didn't break him, it strengthened him, because now, he knew, the chef hadn't died. He had simply moved into every heart that still chose compassion over comfort. The villagers decided to honor him in the way he would have wanted, not with statues or speeches, but with service. That night, they cooked a massive meal, not for themselves, but for nearby flood victims who were suffering just as they once had. The young man led the effort, repeating the chef's old words. "Kindness is not to keep, it's to pass on." They packed food in simple containers and carried it through muddy paths and rising water. Some cried, some smiled, all remembered. Each act of giving that night was a quiet salute to the soldier who had shown them the power of a single meal. As the last pot was emptied, the young man stood beneath the stars, exhausted but content. He looked at his hands, rough, burned, and calloused, just like the chef's once were, and whispered, "I understand now. The fire never went out. It lives in us." Years later, when children asked why they cooked for strangers every year, the villagers would tell the story. They would speak of a soldier who came when no one else did, who cooked not for reward, but for love. They would point to the fire and say, "That's where kindness began." And somewhere, beyond time and distance, maybe the chef smiled, because his mission had never been about survival. It had always been about awakening humanity. The story of the army chef became a legend, but not one written in books. It was written in hearts, in every hand that served another, in every village that refused to give up hope, in every child who learned that strength is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of compassion. And as the fire burned on, illuminating faces that carried both grief and gratitude, the young man finally understood what the chef had meant all along. That even in the darkest flood, the smallest act of kindness can become the light that saves an entire village. The night was quiet again, not because the world had grown still, but because peace had returned to the hearts that once trembled in fear. The river that had swallowed their homes now flowed calmly under the moonlight, reflecting the glow of the small fire that still burned in the center of the village. It had been years since the flood, years since that nameless army chef first arrived and lit that fire. But somehow, every time its flame flickered, it felt like he was still there, unseen, but never gone. The young man sat beside it, listening to the whispers of the elders as they spoke of the past. Children sat around them, their faces painted with curiosity. The story of the soldier who cooked had become more than a tale. It was now a tradition, a living heartbeat that pulsed through every generation. He looked at the faces around him, those who had been saved, those who had grown from that moment, and he realized something profound. The chef's legacy wasn't food, wasn't rescue, wasn't even survival. It was transformation. He looked up at the stars and remembered that winter day when the captain brought the message. The fire never went out. That phrase had stayed with him ever since, echoing through the years like a prayer. Every time life became hard, every time he felt alone or defeated, he would close his eyes and repeat those words. And somehow, they always gave him the strength to begin again. That night, as he stared at the fire, he felt the same familiar warmth that the chef's kitchen once gave him. "He taught me how to cook," he whispered to himself. "But he also taught me how to live." Because the truth was, cooking wasn't just about feeding others. It was about giving them hope, reminding them that they still mattered, even when the world seemed to forget. That was the real recipe the chef had passed on. Not written in a book, but etched in the soul. The wind picked up softly, bending the fire's flame. The young man smiled faintly. "You're still here, aren't you?" he said to the air, as if the chef could hear him. Watching, guiding. And for a moment, it felt as if the flame flickered in response. Not because of the wind, but because somewhere, somehow, kindness had answered back. He stood and looked around the village. Houses rebuilt, children laughing, people helping one another without being asked. Everything carried traces of that one man's compassion. It was strange how someone could come into your life for only a short time and still leave behind something eternal. That was the beauty of quiet heroes. They never seek recognition, yet they change the course of entire lives. The young man had become a leader now, not because he wanted power, but because he understood responsibility. Whenever a storm approached, he prepared before fear could settle in. Whenever someone fell ill, he organized food and care without hesitation. And whenever someone felt hopeless, he would sit beside them and say softly, "I once knew a man who taught me that even when you have nothing, you can still give everything." Every word he spoke, every act he led, carried the essence of the army chef. Simple, humble, but powerful. He often wondered what drove that soldier to stay behind when others moved on. Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was compassion. Or maybe it was something even deeper. The belief that humanity, no matter how broken, is always worth saving. One morning, as he was teaching a group of children how to cook over the open fire, a young girl asked him, "Sir, did the soldier ever come back?" He paused, looking into the flames before answering. "He never left," he said gently. "He's in the food we cook. He's in the hands that help. He's in the fire that still burns." The children nodded, though they didn't fully understand. But someday they would. When life tested them, when storms came again, they would remember that kindness is not something you wait for. It's something you create. As time passed, the village became known for its hospitality. Travelers from distant towns would stop there, always greeted with warm food and warmer smiles. No one left hungry, and no one left untouched by the feeling that this place was different, that it carried a quiet kind of strength. When they asked the villagers why they were so generous, the answer was always the same. Because once, a soldier taught us how to be human. The young man grew older. His hair turned gray, his hands rougher, his pace slower. But every evening, he still sat beside the fire, tending to it with the same care he had as a boy. It had become his way of keeping the promise. To never let the flame die. He would watch the smoke rise and blend with the stars, and he'd feel a peace that words could never describe. Because deep down, he knew that as long as this fire burned, the chef's spirit lived on. One night, after serving food to a passing group of soldiers, he stayed by the fire longer than usual. The sky was clear, the river calm. He looked at the glowing embers and whispered, "You were right. The fire never went out." His voice trembled with gratitude. "You changed us. You changed me?" And as the fire crackled, a spark leapt upward, bright and brief, like a nod from an old friend. The next morning, the villagers found him sitting there, peaceful, eyes closed, a faint smile on his face. The fire was still burning beside him. No one cried loudly. They simply bowed their heads in silence, understanding that his journey had ended exactly where it began. By the flame of kindness. They buried him near the old stone stove and carved his name next to the sign that still read AIF, for those who serve with kindness. From then on, they called it the fire of two souls, one who lit it and one who kept it alive. Years turned into decades, but the story never faded. It traveled far, crossing borders and hearts. And though no one ever knew the soldier's name, his story, their story, became a symbol of what humanity could be at its best. And even now, when storms rage and floods rise somewhere in the world, perhaps another soldier, another stranger, remembers that story. Maybe he lights a small fire for the lost and the hungry, whispering to himself, "The fire never went out," because it truly never does. Kindness, once born, never dies. It simply passes from one soul to another, like a flame that no darkness can ever drown.